Our neighborhood has always been typical white picket fence, suburbia on the outside. Every generation, new young couples move in to replace the older people who have finally left after a lifetime of the same lawns, the same friendly faces. It's always been an idyllic setting in which to raise a family and turn old and grey. Everyone here knows each other. Most have since they were kids, moving into their parents' home once their parents decided it was time to finish out their years somewhere else. I'm an oddball because I'm a transplant. None of my family have ever been able to afford the houses in this area. I'd always driven by with my mom in her beaten-up station wagon, ogling the beautiful homes, meticulously landscaped lawns and lush, green trees. I grew up and was the first in my family to go to college. I didn't waste the opportunity afforded to me and got a nice, cushy job, a kind and caring wife, and a couple of rambunctious kids. The little American dream that was my life was finally wrapped up in a tight little bow when, at the closing, I was handed the keys to my own slice of paradise. We'd only been here for a week when I realized just how odd my neighbors were. At first, I just thought it was because I was a stranger infiltrating their bubble, but the bubble itself seems to have burst altogether. I began to notice that when the neighbors waved to each other while doing their respective yard work, it was a little too forceful, an accompanying grimace painted across their faces that they tried to sell as a smile. The knocking at our door was just slightly too insistent, and the handshakes they gave to welcome us to the neighborhood were just a bit too firm. Their hair was just a tad too perfect. Their eyes were perpetually blank. I began to catch them unashamedly staring at my family and I whenever we ventured out the front door, their neighborly facade seemingly beginning to crack. They were just staring with the same dead eyes I've begun to grow accustomed to, and each time I returned their gaze, I felt my muscles tense and had an overwhelming urge to put as much distance between them and myself as possible. That's when I began to hear things in the dead of night. There was a strange scratching from along our siding, a gentle scraping of something sharp caressing the exterior of our home. It didn't last for long, just a few minutes at most. I peered out the window to see if I could spot the source of the noise, seeing instead a neighbor leering at me through their living room window, their whole house illuminated against the oppressive blackness of the night. In the morning, I inspected the perimeter of my house and found nothing out of place. There were no footprints in the mulch, no marks on the siding. There were no trees with branches close enough to the house to make that noise. I shrugged it off as best I could, but all through work that day the mystery lingered in the back of my mind. The next night, the scratching returned. I peeked again and found no culprit, but did find 3 lit-up houses and 3 neighbors, the original and 2 more, staring in the direction of my home. The next day I called out of work. When the first neighbor emerged to do his daily weeding, I made my way over to him, knowing I needed to see if he'd let me in on what's going on. As I approached, he affixed his unnerving smile and shouted, "Howdy, neighbor." "Hi, Steve," I replied, attempting to return his smile. "How you doing?" he asked me as I noticed that he'd gone an unnaturally long time without blinking. "I'm okay, thanks. I wanted to ask if you'd seen anything in my yard the past couple nights. For the first time since moving here, I saw a flicker of something in one of these robo-people's eyes, and that something was clearly fear. Steve paused a moment before saying, "He's been outside your house. We've been keeping an eye out for you, though. He doesn't like the light." "Who is he? And what have you been watching for?" Steve's eyes glazed over again before he said, "I think I hear Marcia calling me. Good to see you, Cal." And he did a 180 turn before marching away. That night, there was no scratching. I looked out the window, and Steve's windows were as dark as the night was black. 5 other houses on the street stood illuminated with their occupants gazing directly at his house. I returned to bed and drifted into an uneasy sleep. I awoke to screaming, loud and shrill, coming from the direction of Steve's. I hurried to the window and saw Marcia out in the yard, sprinting and shrieking, bathrobe whipping in the wind. I felt the sweat begin to erupt through my palms, and heard my wife stir behind me. "What's going on?" she asked, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. I ignored her. I stood, rooted to the spot, watching Marcia as she continued to run down the street, before a hulking figure that had been lurking in the shadows rushed her. She was caught and hurtled into the air, her cry ceasing immediately as she was dropped to the pavement where she laid, unmoving. The figure turned to me before slinking back into the darkness. All I could do was stare with the same blank eyes my neighbors had. "Go, turn on all the lights," I told my wife.